So most of the sessions that I've done this summer are kind of just general tips and tricks on stuff. But with pivot tables, since the entire focus is pivot tables, I thought it'd be good to show you what a pivot table is, and then we'll back up and look how to make one and how to tweak one. Because if you've never seen one, I can stand up here and describe it all day, but looking at it's a lot easier. So all my lovely fake and very uncreative data that I always have for these classes. So I have a list of fake subjects with the subject ID, the date they enrolled on a trial, their race, ethnicity, gender, and then the trial number. And this is what a pivot table looks like. So we're going to work on how to build this, but just to show you where we're headed, this is a pivot table that takes the data that's in that table and arranges it in a way that you can quickly summarize your data. The main goal of a pivot table is to summarize your data, whether you're counting the number of subjects or adding up all the gigabytes on a server or whatever it is that you do in your job. A pivot table can take a list of data and crunch the numbers for you, so you can avoid, mostly you can avoid lots and lots of formulas, which is great. So this one, I just happen to have it arranged by race, and I've got some filters up here that I could change and pick a certain ethnicity if I needed to, or I also have this nifty slicer on the side that I'll be showing you how to create, where right now it's showing all 3 of the trials. If I wanted to just show the results for trial B, I could do that, or trial A. But that's the general path of where we're going, is a pivot table takes your data and analyzes it, usually as a sum or a total, an average, a count, something like that. And then a pivot chart is basically the same thing, it's just a chart. So, but it's the same thing where I could say, you know, I only want to see trial A and B, and I don't want to see C, and you can kind of edit it on the fly. So one of the great things about the pivot table is that you can slice and dice it in real time without having to make another chart and another chart. You can just use one chart and slice and dice to your heart's content. So that's where we're headed. And to start off then, we're going to create a pivot table. But even before we create the pivot table, I wanted to talk about best practice when it comes to pivot tables. So when you create a pivot table, you're going to start with a list like this. Let's go ahead and start with trials. So this is another fake list of fake trials with various things having to do with trials. And obviously what I use for my classes are things that are relevant to cancer center, trials and patients, things like that. But whatever you do in your job, whether you're counting procedures, numbers of hours worked, whatever it is, it's the same basic principle. But you could build a pivot table right off of this list. However, I highly, in fact, strongly recommend that whenever you're going to use a pivot table, convert your list to a table. If you just use your regular list, depending on how you add data, for example, if you get rid of a row or you add a column or you add an additional row. So for example, with this one, the subjects, if I add a new subject at the bottom, it won't know to go grab that because you said grab this. And now it doesn't know the next one down. So that's why we want to do a table, because then it's a little bit smarter. It understands that when you add to the table, whether it's getting bigger this way or this way, it will actually grab the information. So just best practice to format your list as a table before you actually build the pivot table. To do that then, it's going to be in anywhere inside my table. What's important is that the list that you have, the first row has headings. So you need to make sure every column's got a heading in it that describes what the column holds. And then on the home tab, I'm going to find the format as table button. And as you can see on your handouts, depending on how your Excel is set up, it may be a square button like this, it may be more of a rectangular long button. But I click on format as table, and then basically whatever pretty colors you like to use. I'm an extremely boring person, I always just go with the top one. So, but whatever you like. It's going to pop up and say, did I grab your table correctly? And it's going down to basically row 39, which might be hard to see here, but it's saying where it thinks the table is. If I scroll down, I can see that, yep, it's grabbing the whole table because it's got those dancing ants around the whole thing. That's perfect. If it didn't, I could wipe this out and select my entire table, but it usually is smart enough to grab it. And then the box is ticked saying that your table has headers, which I mentioned you need to do. So you simply say okay at that point, and it gives it that gray and white stripes, which is a little bit easier to read, and it turns on the auto filter feature that we talked about in one of the other tips and tricks sessions. So now it's a table. It doesn't look all that different, but it's identified in Excel as a table. And I know this because now that I've done this, I get this additional table tools at the top, and I've got a design tab. And if I look all the way to the left, it's calling this table 1. It's just as creative as I am. So now I know that I have my table 1. Okay, now that I got my table created, now I'm going to go ahead and actually create the pivot table. And to create a pivot table, you insert it. So I'd go to my insert tab, and the very far left is pivot table. It's going to pop up and realize it. Table 1 is probably what I wanted, so it fills in table 1. If for some reason it didn't, I could just type in table 1. Just keep in mind that you want to not put a space, so it would be table space 1. So it says, I think this is what you want me to analyze. Yes, it is. And then down here, you have to make a choice of, do you want it to be in a new worksheet that it'll create for you, or do you want it on an existing worksheet somewhere? So if you wanted existing, you would change to this existing worksheet circle, and then click inside location and click somewhere that you want it, and that's where it'll put the pivot table. I'm just going to leave it as new worksheet. This one's already kind of cluttered, and just say okay. So it creates a new tab down here, sheet 1, and it's ready for me to build the pivot table. So the first thing we do is we insert the pivot table, and then we build it. To build the pivot table, once it creates the blank one off here on the left, you should have this pane on the right that has the pivot table fields at the top and then 4 areas down below. And we'll walk through how to do that. Basically, to create your pivot table, you need to drag stuff from the top area down to the bottom. So if I wanted a filter on this particular pivot table, I would drag that down to the filters area and let go. And now I have a filter, nothing else, which is really kind of boring. If I wanted to show things by PI, I could drag that down here to rows. Now it's added the rows. And then values is where you're going to put whatever it is you want to summarize. So the thing you want to count, the thing you want to total, the thing you want to average. I've got a list here in my trials that has numbers for total subjects enrolled. So I'm just going to drag that down to the values area. And once I do that, it defaults right here to saying count. Which is a little surprising to me. Usually when you drag something into the values area that contains numbers, it automatically sums it. If it has text or something, it'll do a count. I'm a little surprised it's doing count instead of sum, but there you go. But I'll be showing you how to change that anyway. If you added something to any of those areas and you decide that's not really where you wanted it, you would just click on it down in the area and either drag it up, and you can see as I drag it up, it's changing to an X sign next to my arrow, or drag it to the left, and that just gets rid of it. You can also untick it, either one works. One of the biggest tips I have for pivot tables when you're just getting started is just to play with it. Because the first few pivot tables I put together, I couldn't think through it for some reason. I just had to try and see what worked. And there's still to this day, I'll dump something in columns and go, oh wait, no, that's not how I wanted it. I actually wanted it in rows. So just kind of drag and drop things around so you get with where you want them to be, especially between the columns and the rows. Just move it from one to the other and you can get an idea, a visual example of what it is you're trying to do. If you happen to have a list that has a lot of fields in it, so my trials list here doesn't have too many, it goes over to column K, but you might be trying to analyze a list that has a ton of column headings. If you're working with something that big, it might be hard to find what you need here. You'll have a scroll bar and then drag it down below. You can make it a little bit easier by using the search box up here. So if I was trying to find the column that's called sponsor, I can start typing in sponsor, and now I can click and drag that down. You can also change the way this is sorted. So it automatically wants to do the same order as what it is on your list. So starting from the left, going to the right. But if you have a very long list of columns, what you might want to do is go up to this little cog and choose sort A to Z. And that'll just put all the columns in alphabetical order. So it might just be a little bit easier for you to find the column. No worries. So just in case you have a long list. If you have a short one like me, it's probably not necessary. But just a tip there. Okay, so again, if I drag down to the filters, it's going to add a filter up here, and we'll talk more about filters in just a minute. If I put it in columns and rows, it's going to break the data out by whatever I drop in columns and rows. And then the values will be what it counts or averages or sums, etc. And you don't actually have to have columns and rows. That's one thing that people find kind of interesting. If you just want to honestly total up your entire thing, you don't want to break it out by anything, you can do that by just having the values. So I didn't need to have filters or anything. And it would just say here's the count of the subjects enrolled right now. So it's really up to you. Let's just pick a few here. Okay. So once you've got your values in here, oh, and one other thing on the columns and rows, if you have more than one, so for example, let's say I'm putting, let's do something that's not quite as many different options, disease site and PI on the left, on the rows. Right now, it's because the disease site is on the top, it's first doing by disease site, and then within each disease site, it does PI. That's another thing, just play around with it. If you go, that's not really what I wanted, you can just click and drag these to reorder them. And now it's first doing by PI, and then within each PI, it's doing by disease site. So if you're going to have more than one, just keep in mind, you might want to change the order depending on how you want things to show up. That's just an easy drag and drop to do. Okay, so I mentioned that when you drag things down to values, it usually will sum if it's a number and count if it's a non-number, but you can very easily change that. And as with everything in Excel, there's always like 14 different ways to do the same thing. Whichever one works best for you is the right way. So I'm going to show you a couple ways to do that. So once I've got the values down here where it's saying count of total subjects enrolled, if I click on that drop down, I get value field settings at the bottom. And in here now I can say, you know what, I don't want to count, I want to sum everything that's in that column. And there we go. You could also just right click on the number here and say summarize values by, and I could go to average at that point. So I just took away PI, so we're down to just disease site. So right click summarize values by is another way that you can quickly change how you want that number to be summarized. You can also use something called show values by. So right now I've got my total number of subject enrolls on these types of trials, so it's adding them up. But what I could also do is that right click, show values as, right now it's just doing no calculation, it's adding them up. But there's a whole bunch of stuff in here built into Excel so that you can do more math on it. Please don't ask me too many questions about this. I'm not a math expert. But one of the ones that makes sense to me is percentage of grand total. So if I change that, now I can see the percentage of the grand total for each one. So how much of all of the subjects does each one have? And keep in mind that you can also do more than one field, so that show value as can be helpful when you're trying to do, let's say that right now I've got my total subjects enrolled as a sum, and I'm showing it as a percentage. I can drag it this same field down below again. It dumps back as count, so I'm going to change that. I'm going to change it back to sum. So if you want to see the same field but just calculated different ways, you can do that. You can have one field show up multiple times. You might want to see what is the percentage versus what are the actual counts next to each other. Or maybe you want to see what's the average. Often with the average, it is kind of nice sometimes. So I'm going to change this back to not having a percentage here with that show values as. I'm going to go back to no calculation, because when you're doing averages, sometimes it's nice to know, so I would change this to count, how many are being counted in that average. Is there only one? Is there, let's get rid of that. Oops, got rid of too much there. So I could summarize this by average, and then I could do a count to see how many are being counted toward the average. And keep in mind that when it comes to average, if your list itself that you're basing this on has zeros, then it will be counted in the average. But if it's a blank, it won't even count it, so it won't divide by that. So if you have 5 and 1's a blank, it'll divide by 4. If you have 5 and 1's a 0, it'll count that one, it'll divide by 5. Just something to kind of keep in mind when it comes to averages. And again, the biggest thing I can tell you is just experiment. Just drag and drop to your heart's content until you get to the point where, okay, that's what I was going for. Okay, switching over to the back side here. The most important thing after you built your pivot table, I'm going to take away some of these things just to kind of keep things easy again, is to remember that it doesn't automatically update. And here I have my trials broken out by disease site, but if I go here and so let's change this count of total subjects enrolled by going to summarize values to sum. I'm going to change one of these to a much higher number. Nothing's different. So the thing with pivot tables is you have to tell it to refresh when you want it to grab the new information. Very, very, very important. There's only one thing you remember today. That's probably the biggest thing, is make sure you refresh it. So to do that, you go to the Analyze tab up here. So make sure you're in your pivot table. Otherwise, you're going to be looking for the Analyze tab and never find it. But as long as you're in your pivot table, you'll see the Analyze tab, and then you'll see Refresh. And you do have a couple options here. If you have more than one pivot table, you can do Refresh All, just do them all at once, or the Refresh. And now you see as soon as I do that, then the numbers change. That's the same thing where if I went now to add a new trial, I'm just going to copy most of this stuff here. And then put a nice big number again. So because this is a table and wasn't just a list, it understood as soon as I started entering data into the next empty row that that's part of the table. And that's why then when I go to my pivot table and do my refresh again, it's going to grab that new row. So that's the whole point of that format as table at the beginning. When I add a new row, it knows it the next time I refresh. Otherwise, what would happen is you would have to, if you just left it as a non-table, you would come up to this change data source. And instead of saying table 1, it would just have the A1 through K78, and you would have to change it to K79 to grab the new row. But we don't have to do that because we use the table. As with everything, if you right-click inside there, you also get the refresh option right inside there also. Okay, so that's how to create a basic pivot table. If you wanted to make a chart out of that, then you start with the pivot table. So you need to make the pivot table first. And then once you've got that created, click inside your pivot table, go up to your Analyze tab and say Pivot Chart. And there's lots of different options in here. I'm just going to pick the first one because it's easy. And it defaults to placing it basically right next to your table. You can, change it, make it bigger, whatever. I did want to mention, because sometimes you don't want it to be small or you don't want it right next to your table, you can go to, let's see. Looking at my changes here. If you want to move it, you can go to the Design tab and say Move Chart. You can also right-click, surprise, surprise, and say Move Chart. And then you can move it to a different sheet if you want, or if you want it to be its own chart. That's usually the way I go with a lot of pivot charts. Just say New Sheet, give it a name. Oh, we're in this one. Files, Chart, super creative, and then just bumps it over into its own tab, so it's a little bit bigger. If you created your chart and then decide later, the bar graph isn't working for me, I want something a bit more exciting than that, or whatever, keep in mind that also on that Design tab, you have Change Chart Type. So I could go to a pie graph if that's what I really wanted. And I'm sure you can guess that if you right-click, you get the same option, depending on where you right-click, to change chart type. One of the other things that once you create this, you might not like all these buttons that show up here. They might be a bit of a clutter for you. You can use them to filter, which we'll talk about in just a second. But if you don't like them showing up, you can go to the Format tab, or the Analyze tab, and do the field buttons and say, I don't want any of these, or I just want certain ones, or whatever. So you can get rid of some of those if they start to feel a bit cluttered. That is on the Analyze tab, and that's in your of course. Okay, so moving back to our original pivot table here, let's talk a little bit about slicing and dicing on the fly, because that is one of the biggest strengths of a pivot table. Just keep in mind that right now we have this pivot table and we built a chart on it. When you slice and dice a pivot table that's connected to a chart or vice versa, it will affect the other one. So they're kind of linked. If you wanted one that wasn't going to change your chart, if you wanted a separate one to do slicing and dicing on that doesn't affect your chart, you'd want to build a second one. So for example, right now, if you'll notice, let's change some of those numbers back. It's looking kind of hard to look at with so many large numbers here. So right now I've got my my data showing this way, but if I were to change this and say I just want to see a certain PI, it's actually going to shrink up for the chart also. Same thing here is if I go into PI and say I want all now, it'll change the pivot table. They are linked. Okay, so for the filters, there's a couple different filters that you can work with. Some are the ones that you build when you build your pivot table. So when we built the pivot table, I said you could drag something from up here down into the filter area, and then it would add it at the top. And by the way, if you decide that you want this later, and this is gone because you accidentally got rid of it, to get that back, you would go to the Analyze tab. Again, as long as you're clicked inside your pivot table, your Analyze tab field list will bring that back for you. So I have lost that, yes, accidentally closing it. So when you bring it back, then you could click and drag and add more to your filters. So those are the ones that we decided we wanted at the top. You also get ones when you add things to the rows and columns. So right now, I've got a drop down for this row label. So you have drop downs for both. The ones that you add up at the top, you'll notice it kind of defaults to choosing one. So I can say, I just want to see this one, and it shrinks up to show just that one. You can choose more than one. You just need to turn on this little option down here for select multiple items. And then you can click as many as your heart desires. So once you want to get back what you have, you can always tell that you filtered your pivot table because the little drop down will have what looks like a little funnel or a filter on it. So I can click this and say all and OK, and then click this one, click all, say OK. You can also, if you have it filtered, you can also go up to Analyze, Clear, and Clear Filters. Please, if you decide to do this, which can be helpful because you might have 3 filters and you filter all the different things you don't want to remember. What have I all done? Do I have to find all the buttons? Just get rid of all the filters, bring everything back. It is very handy, but it's the clear filters you want. Watch up here what happens when I choose clear all. Oops. That's all. And that's when we find our undo button and say, oh, thank goodness you exist. So, I talk about this like I've done it before. Yeah. So clear filters is good. Clear all can be good if you're like, oh gosh, I've been playing with this. I've made a mess of it. I just want to start from scratch. That is useful. But just keep in mind, if you did it on accident, that's what the undo button is for. Okay. So as I mentioned, you can use these drop downs to filter the ones at top. You can also filter by the whatever you put into the row. And if I had lots of things in the columns, I'd end up with options for the columns to be filtered also. And then, as I mentioned, how to clear it. You can also sort. So, for example, right now this is sorting alphabetically brain to thoracic. If I wanted to change that, I could say sort C to A with the drop down. So the filter can also give you sorting options inside the table. You can also manually sort this. So, for example, like on my subjects one, what if for some reason, the way we wanted to display our data was having the unknown at the top, not mixed in alphabetically? If you want to manually sort, you would just click on whatever one you want to move, hover over one of the edges, and you'll see that the plus sign changes to 4 arrows. And then I can click and drag and just reorder that. So you can have it whichever way you want. So if A to Z or Z to A isn't exactly what you want, you can do that. And the same thing works with the columns. So you can click and drag the columns to be whatever order you want them to be. Okay. So the slicer that I mentioned earlier that I showed you, that's extremely simple to add. It can be a really nice feature. Get rid of some of this clutter again and make a simpler chart. So inside your pivot chart, you would just go up to the Analyze tab, Insert Slicer button, and then you choose which ones you want to slice on. It's basically the same thing as the filter you have up top. It's just prettier, so it's just a little bit easier to use. So let's say I want PI and phase. We'll go with those two. So you pick the ones you want, pops them down, and now you can kind of click and drag and resize them and do whatever it is you want with them. When you're ready to use them then, you would simply click on it and it filters to that particular phase, or click to filter by a specific PI. This PI doesn't have any phase 1, so if you want to clear the filter, that's what this button up here with the red X is. If you hover over it, it says clear filter because it's trying to be super helpful. So I could clear one or both and get everything back. So that's how we can use the slicers to easily slice and dice our data on the fly. Like the filters up here, it does default to just letting you pick one at a time. If you want to be able to choose more than one, so if I want to be able to choose more than one PI, that's what the other button up there is for, multi-select. If I turn that on, then I can choose more than one. And if I grab one that I didn't mean to, I just click it again to deselect it. And if I want to go back to being able to use just one name at a time, I turned off the multi-select. Now it selects one name at a time. So slicers, super simple to add, but they make you look like you really know what you're doing. I built that using VB code and lots of hours of no. It's great. It's a button. You click it, it turns on. One of the other slicer type things that you might want to try is, let's see here, I need to do something with the dates to get some dates in there. So let's do the subjects one. Oh yeah, so we're going to add the enrolled dates here. Just get rid of that. By the way, if you want to get rid of a slicer, you click on it to select it, hit your delete key, it disappears. Nice and easy. So I'm going to drag the dates up to the columns area, and so now I have all these dates across the top of when the people have their enrolled dates. So with the dates in there, another type of slicer you might want to use is the timeline. So if I go to Analyze, Insert Timeline, there's only one date in this particular list. I'm going to go with that one. And it puts in a little slicer type thing for you. And what this will do is you can say, I just want to see these 3 months. And it'll filter the pivot table to just those 3 months. Or I want to see just these. So it filters it. And has the same clear filter at the top right. You can also change it so that right now it's showing me months. What if I wanted quarters? I could say I only want certain quarters. And it would filter the list to meet whatever you were choosing in that timeline. So again, it makes you look like you built something really super cool, but it's just a click of a button away. Okay. And then the clear button to get rid of it again. Okay. So now we're going to kind of get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of some of the details here. You can get rid of that. So the first thing I want to talk about for changing the display and how you might want to look at things in your pivot tables are dates. So here again, I have the enrolled dates across the top pulled from my table. You can group by that. Right now, it's just going one column for every single date, which probably isn't what I want to do. So with my date selected here, the header inside the pivot table, I'm going to go to Analyze and choose Group Selection. And I'm going to, month is already selected, so I'm going to say month, quarters, and years, and then OK. And now it groups it by that. So now instead of having every single date show, it goes through and adds them up depending on what date they fall in, what month they fall in, and what quarter they fall in. If you want, right now, obviously, there's some months that don't have anybody. If you want to have it show, even if it's empty for that, you would click on the date header, go to Analyze, Field Settings, over here on the left, and then, actually, that's on years, so I want to go down here to months. Field Settings, Layout and Print, and then say, Show items with no data. And that way, if September, October didn't have any dates, it will still show. Depends on what you're trying to do with your data. Sometimes I'll get requests for that. It's like, don't hide the ones that don't have any, show me those too. So I wanted to throw that in there for you. When you're working with dates, I also find it gets really cluttered. So one of the things I wanted to mention is when it comes to columns, if you start doing more than one thing in your columns, you might want to start merging and centering your column labels. And rather than explain that, I'll just show it to you because it's easier to see. So again, click where I want to apply it. I'm going to go to the Analyze tab. I'm going to go to Options, and then the Layout and Format tab, where it says Merge and Center Cells with Labels, and OK. And so basically now, the 3 that fall underneath quarter sits in the middle on top, the year sits in the middle across all of them. I think it's just easier to look at when you start having things in columns, because if everything's off to the left, by the time you reach the last month, you've forgotten what the year is. So it's just it's a formatting thing. It's just something to make things look a little bit clearer, a little bit easier to read. You'll also notice that whenever you start grouping things, you'll get these plus signs and negative signs, so you can expand and contract things at will. You can do it individually if you want to for some reason, but if you do want to expand or contract all of them, That's also on the Analyze tab with the Expand field and Collapse field. So depending on what you're on, if I'm on the year, it'll collapse the year, or it will expand the year. If I'm on quarters, it'll expand the quarters. And that also works if you happen to have, back to our other one, if I happen to have more than one thing in the rows, you also get those plus and minuses. That also works for those. So expand, collapse, will collapse all of them, not just the one that you're on. If you want to collapse just one, that's what the plus and minus is for. If you find that kind of frustrating, honestly, I never seem to actually want to expand and collapse. I just want it all. So I want to see all my data at once. You can actually get rid of those plus signs so you don't have to expand and collapse, or you don't accidentally click on something and collapse it. So if you want to do that, you would go to the Analyze tab, and then this plus and minus buttons over here on the left, far right, and that would just turn them off. So you're not going to be accidentally shrinking and expanding stuff when you click around inside your pivot table. You also can decide whether or not you want to have subtotals or totals. So on this one, we have a grand total at the bottom. Depending on what the pivot table is that you build, you might end up with one on the right for the columns also. And then depending on what you add here, you may end up with subtotals for different pieces that you put into your row. So for right now, it's doing the totals for each disease site, because that's what's at the top. You can turn those on and off also. You can either right-click on whatever it is you want to do the subtotal for, or get rid of the subtotal for. So this one actually has it. So if I click it, it turns it off. Turn it off, turn it on with the right click. And as well as the right click, you can also go to the Design tab to do that, where you can say which do not show subtotals, show them at the top or the bottom. Same thing with your grand totals, if you want to get rid of those or have them for just the column or just the rows. Okay. One of the things I find myself doing quite often, actually, especially when I have a lot of data in like this, is changing the way that it's shown to me. So while we're in this Design tab, the other thing I wanted to show you here is Report Layout. And this is just kind of, again, play around with it, see what you like. You can say the compact form, I think, is the default. You can say I want to see it in outline form, or I want to see it in tabular form. Get rid of that. So whichever one works best for you. I tend to end up needing something where I don't like that it has it in one and doesn't have it in the ones under it, because I end up usually taking this data and like doing VLOOKUPs on it, which means that if I'm missing, if I've got something blank, it doesn't work very well. So you also have the option to go back to Design and say repeat all item level labels, and then it'll show up in every row. So again, it depends on what you're trying to do with it. Some people think it looks cleaner that way, but if you need to do some analysis on it, you might want it to show up for every single row. And that was under the report layout, changing the different form and changing the labels on and off. All right, speaking of format then, so right now we have our averages showing up here. Let's get rid of some of these. Busy again. So now that these averages are showing up with quite a few decimals, because it must have an interesting division there, I wanted to talk about how you can change the format. When you go to create your pivot table, you can actually do it then. So when I click and drag something down here, I can go into that field settings where I might want to change the sum or whatever. Right here inside this box, you have number format. So you can change it inside here when you're adding it. Once you've got it in, you can also change it. But here's the quirky thing, is if I were to, for example, right click on this and say format cells or number format, and I want it to be a number with just 2 decimal places, that works for that one. I don't know, I did it for the entire column. That may be different on versions, because I think on my version back on my desktop at work, you can change an individual cell, but if you want them all to change, you do the header. So just keep that in mind. But if it doesn't change for everything, try doing a number format on the header, and that should usually work. So if you have percentages or decimals or whatever it is you want to change, a right click to number format will do that for you. Or format cells if it's not a number. Some other things that can come in handy that if you spend way too much time in Excel and have bumped up against is the pivot table options. So inside my pivot table, I'm going to go to Analyze, and the far left I'll find Options, or I can right click in, say, pivot table options, either one. And a few other things I wanted to mention here. We talked earlier about merge and center cells with labels, so that's found there. Also, the auto-fit column widths on update, which is near the bottom of this first tab, I usually untick that because it drives me nuts when I'm, especially like using the slicers, when you were seeing with the dates and stuff, it would jump around or whatever. Or if I've manually said, I want this column to be not quite so big because it's taking up too much space, and then as soon as I refresh, it jumps right back to where it was. So if I took the time to kind of change the width of my columns every time I hit refresh, I don't want it to go back to what it thinks I should have. Just untick that box, and that way it won't undo all of your hard, pretty work. Let's see. Something else that can be nice there is if you happen to have a 0, so let's get one that's got a 0 in here somewhere. Get rid of some of these extras. Change that to be sum instead of count again. So you'll notice some of these have blanks. It's really, again, a personal preference thing. If you don't want the blanks to show as blanks, you can go back to that options that we talked about, and it says for empty value show, and I could put in empty, and the word empty would show up if you want to call it out that way. You might want to put in a 0. Just keep in mind that when I talked earlier about averages, if you change your raw data, the table that this is built on, by using 0s instead of blanks, then it will be counted in those averages. But changing it just to show a blank won't. So it's not the same thing as changing your actual data, which may be good. It's just a personal preference. One of the quirks, wow, this went a lot faster. I timed this. Apparently, I got really long-winded back at my desk, was just raving about the benefits of pivot tables. You don't want to see when I practice, it's pretty ugly. But one of the quirks about pivot tables, I'm honestly surprised I haven't accidentally done it just while I'm teaching, is that whenever I work with them, sooner or later, I always end up double clicking on something. Now this is not going to do. Yeah, and that happens. So if you double click in a pivot table, it'll actually create a new sheet with details about what you double clicked on. It's like, oh, you must be super interested in this because you double clicked on it. And I'm like, no, I'm really not. So literally a double click and I'll end up with like 5 new tabs down there, and I'm going, why are you doing this to me? So some people like that. It's drilling down into the data. It's what they want. That's fine. But if you want to turn that off, one of my favorite parts of the options is that if you go to, let's see, the data tab inside pivot table options, kind of far off to the right here, and then it's enable show details. If you untick enable show details, now if I double click, it just gives me an error message saying, I can't turn me off. I really want to make another tab. I'm like, sorry, because I just double click way too much. I end up with way too many tabs. So that's actually all I have to cover with you. Does anybody have any questions? Want to see that? I can't tell if you're extremely bored or if you're just overwhelmed with the information. Yeah, so much to think about. I do recommend just finding a simple list, go back to your desk and just play around with it. Don't necessarily say, I'm going to build a pivot table that does this, because that can lead you awry, but just build one and start playing around, and you'll be surprised at how many ways you can slice and dice your data. That if you used to build a bunch of formulas to say, count this much by this, or all those formulas I taught you and the other stuff like sum if and count if, you don't really need to remember those formulas because this thing does it for you. It basically does the sum if, count if, right inside the chart. So, all right, I will please make sure you signed into the sign-in sheet so I can send you an email copy of the handout.